He has died as a brave man should, said the emperor, and that is in deciding the battle. France loses one of her best officers. His Majesty immediately set off at a gallop in front of the cavalry to join the King of Naples and make such dispositions as he considered necessary to assure and follow up of the success. Marshal Ney and the Viceroy had supported the decisive movement of General Caulaincourt. The enemy's counterattack on the Great Redoubt was in vain, and the Russians were forced to retreat along the whole of their front. One redoubt still remained to them, as well as a little field work that commanded the Moscow road, and it seemed as though they wished to hold them. A thin wood covered their march and concealed their movements from us at this point. The emperor flattered himself that the Russians were going to hasten their retreat, and he reckoned on hurling his cavalry on them in an attempt to break them. The young guard and the Poles were already on the march towards these outworks which the Russians held. In order to make out their movements, the emperor went with the sharpshooters. Bullets whistled around them, and he had made his consort stay behind. Seeing me at his side, the emperor told me to go back. It is over, he said. Go and wait for me at the headquarters. I thanked him, but remained with him. The emperor was certainly running a great risk, as the fusillade became so lively that the King of Naples and several generals hurried up to urge him to retire. The emperor then went in front of the columns that were coming up. The old guard followed them. The carabineers and the cavalry marched in echelon. The emperor seemed determined to carry these last Russian fieldworks, but the Prince of Neuchatel and the King of Naples pointed out to him that the troops were marching thither without any commander, that nearly all of the divisions in the army had likewise been deprived of their commanding officers through death or wounds, that the regiments of cavalry and infantry were, as he could see, greatly reduced in length. They added that it was growing late, and that though the enemy were certainly retreating, they were doing so in good order and showing an inclination to dispute every inch of the ground tenaciously, whatever the havoc wrought in their ranks by our guns. They also urged that the only chance of success was to use the old guard for the attack, and that in existing circumstances, success at such a price would really be a check, while failure would be a reverse that would counterbalance the entire success of the battle. Finally, they urged him not to engage the only corps in the whole army which remained intact and ought to be kept so for future occasions. The emperor hesitated. He went forward once more to observe for himself the enemy's movements. Meanwhile, the King of Naples and the Prince of Neuchatel had, in different directions, reached the walls of these redoubts. They joined the emperor, whom they assured that the Russians were in position and far from retreating, that several corps were massing, and with the look of men determined to retreat no longer. All the successive reports represented our losses as very considerable. The emperor came to a decision. He suspended the order for an attack and contented himself with sending up supports for the corps still engaged, and in case the enemy should be planning a counterattack. This was unlikely, for their own losses were so immense. Nightfall put an end to the fighting. Both sides were so weary that in several places firing ceased without orders having been given. At night the emperor established his headquarters at the spot where he had taken up his stand, and at the beginning of the battle, on this side of the redoubts. Never had a battle cost so many generals and officers. Success was hardly won, and the fire was so murderous that generals, like their subordinate officers, had to pay in person for victory. We did all we could for the wounded whilst the battle was raging and during the night that followed, but most of the houses in the vicinity of the battlefield had been burned during the day, and in consequence many casualty stations passed the night without shelter. There were very few prisoners. The Russians showed the utmost tenacity. Their field works and the ground they were forced to yield were given up without disorder. Their ranks did not break, pounded by the artillery, sabred by the cavalry, forced back at the bayonet point of our infantry. Their somewhat immobile masses met death bravely, and only gave way slowly before the fury of our attacks. Several times the emperor repeated that it was quite inexplicable to him that the redoubts and positions so audaciously captured and so doggedly defended should yield us so few prisoners. Several times he asked of the officers who came with reports of our successes where the prisoners were who ought to have been captured. He even sent orderlies to the various positions to make sure that more had not been taken. These successes, yielding neither prisoners nor trophies, made him discontented. Several times he said to the Prince of Neuchatel and me, "These Russians let themselves be killed like automatons. They are not taken alive. This does not help us at all. These citadels should be demolished with cannon." That night the enemy began their retreat in plain view. Orders were given for the army to follow their movements. At dawn on the following day, September 8th, there were only Cossacks in sight, and they were 5 miles away from the battlefield. The enemy had taken with them the great part of their wounded, and we had only the few prisoners I have mentioned, 12 guns from the redoubt captured by my unfortunate brother, and 3 or 4 other pieces taken in line by our troops during their first attack. From the early morning, the emperor was out in all parts of the battlefield supervising with the utmost care the collection and removal of the wounded, Russian as well as French. Never was a battlefield so thickly strewn with dead. In the village round which the attack had centered, the Russian dead lay in heaps. On the plateau behind it, the ground was covered with corpses of Litovsky and Ismailovsky's guard, slaughtered by our guns. The emperor carefully examined every portion of the battlefield, the positions of each corps, the movements they had made, the difficulties they had had to overcome. At each point he demanded minute details of everything that happened, dealt out praise and encouragement, and was greeted by his troops with all their wonted enthusiasm. The emperor took stock in detail of all the works thrown up by the Russians. I cannot describe my feelings as I passed over the ground which had been dyed by my brother's blood. If the eulogies and the justice rendered by an entire army to the memory of the brave man could have consoled me, I ought to have peace in my heart. After completing his reconnaissance, the emperor galloped off to the advance guard. According to reports which he had received that morning from the King of Naples, there were none but Cossacks to be seen. A very small number of stragglers were rounded up. The enemy had not abandoned so much as the cart. The king mounted on passing Mojasek and made the emperor agree to establish headquarters there that evening. But when he arrived before the town, he found it strangely held by enemy infantry and a large body of cavalry. A late start had been made, and the day was declining. Not to be able to reconnoiter the position, we were obliged to come to a halt. The emperor established himself in the village in front of the Moyaisk. The enemy evacuated the town during the night, and our troops entered it by the next day at dawn. The emperor went into the town toward noon. He was very much preoccupied, for affairs in Spain were weighing him down, just when those in Russia, despite the victorious battle, were far from satisfactory. The state of the various corps which he had seen was deplorable. All were sadly reduced in strength. His victory had cost him dear. When he had come to a halt on the previous evening, he had felt convinced that this bloody battle, fought with an enemy who had abandoned nothing in their retreat, would have no result beyond allowing him to gain further ground. The prospect of entering Moscow still enticed him, however, but even that success would be inconclusive so long as the Russian army remained unbroken. Everyone noticed that the emperor was very thoughtful and worried, although he frequently repeated, "Peace lies in Moscow. When the great nobles of Russia see us masters of the capital, they will think twice about fighting on. If I liberated the serfs, it would smash all those great fortunes. The battle will open on the eyes of my brother Alexander, and the capture of Moscow will open the eyes of his nobles.